The 1980s saw Nintendo completely revitalising the game industry with NES, setting a new standard for quality and accessibility in games worldwide. The world eagerly awaited what Nintendo would do next, and in September of 1987, Hiroshi Yamauchi, the then president of Nintendo, announced that the follow-up to the NES was in development. Masayuki Uemura, the architect of the NES's success, once again headed up the development of the new console. Titled the Super Famicom in Japan and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, in the rest of the world. The new console was a massive step up over the previous generation in every way. 8-bit graphics were out and 16-bit was in. Sprites were typically much bigger with far more of them on screen compared to before, with the larger colour palette leading to way higher levels of detail and variety in games. None of this was unique to the SNES though. The 16-bit era the fourth console generation became known as technically kicked off some years before the SNES launched, with the TurboGrafx 16 launching in 1987 and the Sega Genesis a year later in 1988. However, the SNES had several features that set it apart from the competition. The 3D era that was ushered in by the fifth console generation was still a long way away, and as a result of this, console and game developers had to come up with creative ways to get faux 3D into their games. The first and probably most well-known of these is Mode 7. Of the SNES's 8 possible graphics modes that could be used to render a game, the final one, Mode 7, was the most interesting and unique at the time. It enabled the scaling, rotation and transformation of the background layer on a scanline by scanline basis, which could be used to create some stunning effects. It was used in many SNES games. Mario Kart and F-Zero used it to form their tracks and courses. The Final Fantasy games used it to present their world maps in what felt like full 3D at the time. It had its limitations. It couldn't be used on sprites, so any sprites that are meant to follow the manipulation of the background have to be hand-drawn appropriately in order to mimic the effect. Nothing else at the time had any comparable hardware to do this. It was possible to achieve the effect manually on platforms such as the Genesis, however this was incredibly tedious compared to on the SNES. Another way the SNES achieved 3D was through the use of a specially designed and manufactured chip on some game cartridges. Designed by Argonaut Games and codenamed Mario FX, standing for Mathematical, Argonaut, Rotation, and Input-Output. The chip was used to render 3D polygons and 2D effects that couldn't otherwise be handled by the SNES itself. A mere 8 games were released that used the Super FX chip. This was mainly due to the high manufacturing costs of the cartridges necessary for it, which generally resulted in higher costs for the consumer. These titles included Star Fox, which had mind-blowing 3D graphics at the time, and what was a seemingly impossible port of the seminal PC first-person shooter, Doom. While the SNES was being designed, a Sony engineer named Ken Kutaragi, after seeing his daughter playing a Famicom and recognising the potential in the medium, reached out to Nintendo with a proposal of developing the sound chip for the new console. Nintendo accepted, and work on what would become the SPC 700 sound processor for the SNES began. Kutaragi's work was done entirely in secret, with his superiors at Sony having no knowledge of his work. Upon finding out, they were furious and rallied to have him fired. Fortunately for him, the CEO of Sony at the time agreed with Kutaragi's assessment of the potential of games and allowed him to keep his job. The SPC 700 was an incredibly advanced chip for the time, and was the first of its kind to produce digital stereo sound. This allowed the SNES to have excellent sound capabilities and audio that was generally considered to be far above the competition at the time. The SNES was released in Japan on November 21st, 1990, and in North America 9 months later, with the EU having to wait a further year. Retailing at 25,000 yen, or $200 in the US, which is around $400 today. It was an immediate success, selling out almost instantly in Japan, shipping over 300,000 units. This prompted the Japanese government to ask console manufacturers to schedule console releases for the weekend. Such was the demand. It reportedly even gained the attention of the Yakuza, a criminal organisation in Japan. Units were shipped in secret and at night to avoid deliveries being stolen, under the guise of Operation Midnight Shipping, which kind of sounds like a game in itself. At launch in Japan, Nintendo managed to go one better than the NES by having only 2 games available to buy. Somehow though, this was still putting their best foot forward, Super Mario World and F-Zero being the 2 titles, both of which are now regarded as 2 of the best games ever made. The North American launch added Pilot Wings, SimCity and Gradius 3 to its lineup, giving players slightly more choice. The SNES very quickly outsold its rivals in Sega and the TurboGrafx 16, reseating itself at the top of the pyramid in much the same way it had done with the NES in the 80s, with several key third-party developers remaining close to Nintendo. In a similar manner to the NES, the console's design differed over the various regions, with Japan and PAL territories having one iteration and North America having another. They both featured a predominantly grey shell, however the Japanese and PAL systems had a more curved design and had coloured buttons on the controller, with the North American design sticking predominantly to grey with purple accents. The success of Nintendo and Sony's partnership on the SPC 700 sound processor, and the emergence of CDs as a media format prompted Nintendo to start work on a CD-based add-on for the SNES to compete with the Sega CD. Their previous partnership and Sony's work in making the CD format viable made teaming up to work on this an obvious choice. Once again, Ken Kutaragi would head up the project from Sony's side of things, developing what would become the Nintendo PlayStation. Unfortunately though, the deal fell through. It made Nintendo's then president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, uncomfortable due to licensing rights to the Super Disc format staying with Sony, something that Nintendo was unaccustomed to due to having exclusive control over licensing with the NES and the SNES so far. Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa travelled to Amsterdam to meet with executives from Philips in secret, Philips being Sony's biggest rival at the time. It was hoped that they would be able to strike a deal that was more favourable to Nintendo than the current one with Sony. The final nail in the coffin of the Sony deal was at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. Sony revealed a prototype of the Nintendo PlayStation to an excited audience, only for Nintendo to announce their partnership with Philips the following day of the show. The Philips deal was eventually cancelled without any prototypes being made, however somewhat ironically, it did allow them to retain the rights to produce games based on several Nintendo properties, which it eventually did for its own CD-based console, the Philips CDI. And well, as for Sony, they didn't sleep on the whole PlayStation thing for very long. Nintendo's entry to the 16-bit console generation continued the massive success that they had seen with the NES in the decade before. The console received support long after it was supplanted by newer hardware. In most territories it was discontinued in 1998, however not until 2003 in Japan and Brazil, giving it a 13-year life of some description. Across its life, it sold over 49 million units. This was noticeably less than the NES, but still a considerable amount nonetheless. It rendered it the best-selling console of the generation, comfortably beating out the competition from Sega once again. A respectable 1,700 games were released for the SNES over its tenure, over double that of the previous generation, with many of them going on to be regarded as some of the best games ever made. In much the same way, and likely due to the success of the NES Classic, Nintendo announced the Super Nintendo Classic Edition in 2017. It functioned more or less identically to the NES Classic, offering USB power and HDMI output to connect the console to modern displays. 21 games were included with the system, featuring most of the classics that had become associated with the SNES, including Zelda: A Link to the Past, Donkey Kong Country, and Star Fox. Interestingly, the previously unreleased Star Fox 2 was also featured on the console, making it the first time it was officially available to be played by the public. Nintendo seemed to learn somewhat from the mistakes that they had made with the distribution of the NES Classic, with this one being significantly easier to get a hold of by comparison. That being said, they still got hit pretty hard by scalpers and bots, making them still less than readily available for anybody who wanted one. As with the NES, a selection of SNES games became available through Nintendo Switch Online in 2019. Most of the console's standout and popular games have since hit the service, making this the most convenient legal way to play these games today. Nintendo continued to dominate the competition throughout the fourth console generation, setting itself up to be the number one name in gaming at the time. It pioneered new techniques to bring some semblance of 3D gaming onto consoles that otherwise had no business running them in the early 90s. It still sits comfortably in the list of best-selling consoles of all time, and regularly finds itself atop of best console ever lists. The SNES continued to evolve franchises like Mario and Zelda, and catapulted others into the limelight, making them household names today. Thank you for watching. If you managed to get to the end of the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you'd like to see more content like this. Do you have fond memories of the SNES? And what was your favourite game for it? What was your first exposure to it when it hit Nintendo Switch Online recently? Let me know down in the comments.